Hello. In this episode, we have my friend and SAP developer advocate colleague Marius Obert on to take us through the detail of the final component in the SAP Techa 2020 developer Keynote repository, and that is the front-end component, essentially the UI to the entire show. It uses integration cards, UI integration cards, that we get working locally first of all, and then we deploy to SAP Business Technology Platform using the Launchpad service, and we'll see how everything is put together, mostly, surprisingly and beautifully, declaratively. Let's go.
Okay, so welcome, Marius. This is the last component, but certainly not the least component. In some ways, I think many people would say it's the most important because it's the UI, it's the front end. So Marius, you're going to talk us through what the front-end component is, what it does, and also how it's built and deployed.
Yes, thank you for inviting me, DJ. I fully agree. The UI is the most important part because, I mean, that was obviously kind of part joke, but part true because that's what the end users see. I mean, if something, no matter where something is broken, the end users will notice it in the UI. And this is something that you always have to keep in the back of your mind when you're developing the UI. In this case here, as you might know, if you watch the previous videos, we were talking about the charity scenario or the charity project of the SAP developer keynote, where the idea was that per dollar revenue that our fictional company generates, we accumulate credits that we are going to donate for a good cause. And to see how much credits we already accumulated, we want to build a dashboard with not too much development effort, but it should look clean and nice and display the most important data at one glance.
Nice.
And here is basic a screenshot of this dashboard, how it would look. You see it looks like a typical SAP Fiori application. You have the shell bar header with the dark blue. And here we see 4 so-called integration cards, each of which shows a couple of KPIs and a chart. So the first one shows a stacked column chart, the second one a line chart, and the last one is radio chart.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm always impressed by these charts. They look so good, but they also look so difficult to achieve. But I think we're going to find out that that's not quite the case, right?
We will, yes. It's actually, I'm a developer and I see myself as a developer, but I don't see myself as a designer. So if I can do that, everyone can do that.
That's my line.
I stole it. Yeah.
So this screenshot is on in the repo, right?
Exactly. Let's start with that point. Here, let's go on the main README page of the repo. I'm sure you've visited that page dozens of times or hundreds of times already. And then when you scroll down, you see one folder that's called UI. And when you click on that folder, you end up at the page that you just saw in the beginning. This is how the application will look. If you go a little bit further down, you see the overall architecture chart with this red box circling or the front end, and you see how it relates to the other components that you might know from the previous video, such as wrap here. From the very last video, like last week.
Exactly, yeah. So this is the famous whiteboard. We've covered, I think, all the components up until the front end one now. And that little green line there is showing us that, as we'll see, I'm sure, that it's connected somehow with consuming data from somehow the charity component.
Yes, and actually that's a good cue for me, because in the first step, we'll run the application locally in the SAP Business Application Studio. So obviously it is also in the cloud, but locally in the sense that it's just in the control of the developer. You don't deploy it anywhere else. You don't share it with colleagues. It's just for you as a developer, a small sandbox if you want. And this sandbox won't have this connection. So the first sandbox will be with the sample data that is embedded in the project directly.
Yeah, I think we as a developer community generally, I think we need to come up with a different term from local, cloud local.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are more and more development environments online these days. What word should we use? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, this
Yeah.
is the business application studio that you got a dev space, as we have done for most of the components in the developer Keynote repository. We've tried to use the application studio because it's a really nice level playing field for everybody.
Exactly. And that won't take too long, the first part with the sample data. In the second step, we basically still run the application, quote unquote, locally, but this time with real data. So this is where we establish the first version of this connection of the screen line here.
Right.
Yeah. And then in the next part, we would actually deploy it to the cloud and you will see it live in action. But first things first, let's start with the most simple scenario, the local run with the mocked data. So here you see that I cloned the developer Keynote repository. If I show you my directory, you see this is the main repo. I'm already in the UI folder, which is why you only see these files here.
Yeah.
If you just clone the repo and you haven't used this component yet, you might have a few folders less, such as the node modules folder is missing and this mta archives. This is just because I did a try run before, but you can just follow along. And when you follow along, one by one, these folders will also appear in your Project Explorer on the left.
Exactly, and just as a point of orientation as well, I know a lot of the folks have forked the repo as well to their own ownership space on GitHub.com, and you can either clone that fork, or you could even for this particular component, you could even just clone the original repo, because you're not trying to deploy anything to that GitHub repo space. So yeah, clone it from either of your own or our SAP samples versions.
Yeah. Yes, that doesn't matter in this case. You're right. Let's go back to the README that has the simple instructions that we need. First, install all dependencies, and then replace the first route in the access-app.json file with this string. Let's copy that and then jump over to see what this actually means.
Yeah.
So first, run npm install. This will be very fast for me because I already have all the dependencies installed here.
And that's what you were referring to just now with the node_modules directory. That already existed because you just did it earlier. Yeah.
Exactly. And here is this access-app.json file. And this is the first route as it looks right now. So it basically takes all traffic that starts with /SAP/credits and redirects it to the wrap destination and adds this target string to it that says credits by month, which is the endpoint of the OData service that Rich provided in the last video. And we request the data in the JSON format, which is typically what we want when we deploy the application. But as we want to start with this sandbox-like scenario with our local test data, we replace this for now. And we say, actually served redirected traffic to the local directory sample and target the credits.json file in this folder.
This is such a great example. When I read through the approuter documentation, I always wanted to find a use case for using local dir, and this is a perfect example. When you're just testing locally, you're going to be using an OData service eventually, like we are going to be doing with Rich's charity component. But before that happens, before that's available, we can make up our own OData service and stick the representation in a local JSON file.
Yes, and that makes it super easy. For example, I know you know this, DJ, but for our watchers, UI5 comes out of the box with this mock version that you can host this mock server that also exposes OData entities. This is a different thing here because here we're talking about the approuter. So it doesn't need to be a UI5 application. It could be any web application or just a static HTML page. So this is on a different level if you want.
Yeah, that's a good explanation.
Yeah. So let's have a look at that data. It's in the sample directory and called credits.json. So there is only one file here, so it's not hard to find. And here you already see this is the sample data.
That's my favorite property name of all time, the single D there that tells me
Yeah.
and I think most people watching what this really is, right?
Yeah. So what is it?
It's an OData v2 JSON representation of an
Exactly.
entity set.
Exactly. And you can also see that I was lazy and I copied the entire payload of a sample system in an earlier development stage and dropped it in here. And that's why you still see this metadata property that we technically don't need. But as I was lazy and I copied it, it's still here.
As we all know, laziness is one of the 3 great virtues of any good programmer.
Absolutely. And that's all we need to do. So just to be sure, let's go back to the README, but it says run the application router with npm start. So let's do that here. And you see it started after a second or two on port 5000. The SAP Business Application Studio notices this open port and gives us this option just to open it or access this tab, this port in another tab. And that's
So
what
it
I
sort of
just
provides
clicked here.
like a reverse proxy to that that port that's being listened to by the approuter locally, quote unquote, in the cloud. But of course, in order to access that from our browser, the App Studio needs to do a little bit of magic for us.
Exactly. And here in the URL, we can see that we're still in the App Studio if you want. In the workspace of the App Studio, this is my workspace ID. And app1, so this is the first port we expose. If we were to open a second port, the URL would most likely be app2 here. But all that we are currently interested in is our web application that, let's open the DevTools, see cache is disabled, and we can pull in the data as we need it.
Yep,
And it's
so that's coming
live.
straight from
Yeah.
that credits.json file. Nothing in the cache, nothing up your sleeve, basically. I do think
wearing
that
t-shirt.
nothing up your t-shirt sleeve. I do think that people who have the dev tools opening by default on the left-hand side are cooler than they look. So that's quite a nice thing. Even though also it helps us with our our video faces over the right-hand side. But yeah, it's like, oh yeah, now Marius is pretty cool.
Thank you. So that's all for the first part. The application is running locally. So let's make the switch to point to the real data, because this is probably, once you're at a certain stage, this is during development, this is where you will be most of the time, to connect to real data, because at some point the mock data won't be enough for you. So there's basically not a lot we need to do. We just have to create this default-env.json file. Let me copy the file name here.
And while you copy that, the default-env.json file name is probably going to be familiar to those who have looked at some of the other components in the developer Keynote repository, right?
Yes, because I mean, this is, if you go in the very lowest level, this is the configuration file of the XSenv package on NPM from SAP, and many other packages, such as the application router, make use of this XSenv. And in this developer Keynote, for example, you might know it from the S4 knock system, for example.
Exactly. So it's a good file format to get to know better, I think.
Absolutely. So let's create this file in the root of our component here. Let's also fill it with some data. Let me copy it from here.
Sure.
So basically the value that I copied is the same value that is suggested here, but I already pre-filled this underscore, underscore, underscore.
Ah, yes, I was going to ask about that. So that URL there in line 8, that is the URL to the OData service that's being exposed by the charity component, which we saw in the previous episode in this series, that's being served by the Steampunk ABAP stack.
Correct. And another thing that it's important to notice here is, I mean, probably besides line 8 is line 4, where we define the name, rep, and line 6, where we say, okay, here we currently use basic authentication, but we don't provide the username and don't provide a password at this point.
Gotcha. And while we're, to use my favorite phrase, while we're staring at this JSON stanza here, I think it's also worth observing that lines 4 all the way through 8, those particular properties, they're the sort of the minimal properties that you would provide values for if you were defining a destination using the cockpit, right? So it's exactly the same data that we're defining here. We're just defining it in JSON rather than through a GUI.
It's exactly the same. You're right. So one thing, we need to do one more thing before we can test this local application with the real data, because previously we replaced the first route here to point to this file here, but now we actually want to use a destination. So let's just undo the changes and save the file. So this is how the file was previously before we did the first part. And now all we need to do is just stop the approuter with Control or Command and C, depending on your operation system, and start it again.
So just to be clear, for those not as familiar with the way that routes work here, if I get this right, Marius, we're saying in that first object in the routes there that any request coming in to /SAP/credits, and that little circumflex matches it at the start of the line, reverse proxy that call to a service which is defined by the wrap named destination service, and specifically add on to the end of the URL in that service definition that particular path /credits by month $$ format equals JSON, right? So that's what the approuter is doing for us here, which is translating incoming request to SAP credits to the real thing.
You nailed it. Exactly. That's what's happening here. And as we are at this talking about it anyway, so here there is a second route that does more or less the same, but the regex here is more generous. So basically it matches anything that hasn't been matched up here. And with this $1, it basically takes the first match group and forwards this to the local directory called dashboard as well.
And it's important that the routes are in this order. Otherwise, that second one would catch everything and not allow that redirection for the OData service.
That's a common mistake I see and I make all the time. So.
Yeah, me too. Me too.
So going back to the application, we restarted the approuter. Let's refresh it one more time. Before I refresh it, let's remember the numbers here. So before it was 55.7, 106.1. And now we should see different data because we're connecting to a different data source.
So the 55 and the 106 or 107 were from the credits.json, but now this is coming straight from the ABAP stack.
Exactly. So 20.4 and 35.1. And one thing you might encounter if you code along, that now your browser probably prompts you for a username and password. But because we did a try run, the credentials are still cached in my browser session, which is why I haven't been prompted a second time.
And we didn't want to expose that user ID and password on the screen in the file to ULOT.
Yeah, that would have worked, but yeah, as you said, that's not what we want to do because it might be a security issue depending on what type of projects you work on.
Yeah,
if it's not a if you don't live stream anything on YouTube.
Okay, so we've gone from the cards being fleshed out with data from a local file to cards being fleshed out with data from a real OData service, but this is all still running locally, right?
Yeah, let's change that, huh?
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's go to the last section. You see, same as the previous two sections, the last section is also very small. All we need to do here is basically to build the application or to subscribe to the Launchpad service first. I've already done that. Behind this link, there is a tutorial in case you want to know how this happens or how it works.
So this is like a normal subscription you would partake of using the cockpit services and saying, yeah, I would like that, please, in my trial account.
Yes. And then the second step is just to build a project. The third one is to deploy it. And the last one is to access it. Pretty easy. So let's do that. And let's jump over to the code here. And before we do that, I want to show you one more trick. You don't have to do it, but I think it's always a interesting trick. So here there is this destinations.json file. And this defines the init data to create a new destination with the name RUB that will be created once you deploy the application. And that will make it a little bit easier for us later on. So let's use this file here. Let me copy again from my, yeah.
I'm reminded of the fact that in the mock server component elsewhere in this developer Keynote repository, there's also a destination.json file, and I think I put in the comments there, we've left this in for reference, we don't really use it, but this is where we're actually using a real destination.json file to have a destination created for us when an instance of the destination service is created, right?
Absolutely. So let's maybe show first how we reference it, and then let's have a look at the file content. So here in the mta.yaml, where we define all service instances, we also define the service instance for the destination service, where the service name is defined, the service type, the service plan, and here in the path, we link the destinations.json file.
Yep.
And in the file here, we are a little bit more specific. We say, okay, create one destination or a sub-account destination that basically you could create multiple destinations. One is sufficient in our case here with the name RUB. The description is automatically generated destination, so we know where this destination is coming from. Authentication is basic authentication. Here we also provide the user, but we don't provide a password at this point, because if we were to provide the password here, it would be stored insecurely.
Yeah, it might end up in the history. Yeah,
exactly. And then the same URL as we previously used. This is all that we want to do here. So let's build the application. You could use let me use the UI here, but as you see in the repo, you could also use the command line. And same as you could use the command line to deploy the application, which is, I know you, DJ, you usually prefer that, but I think it's worth showing both options from every now and then.
By the way, when you were talking to me about this, you mentioned you used the phrase managed approuter, right? And this is what we're using here, right? So is now a good time to tell us a little bit about what a managed approuter is and how it differs to the approuter we've seen just now?
Sure. So maybe the approuter that we've seen until now is also what we used here for this local run scenario. So let's have a look at this package.json file. You see it's a Node application that has one dependency, that is the SAP approuter. And when we want to start the application, we basically start this approuter from the dependency. So we don't have any custom code here.
That to me has always been a thing of beauty. There's no index.js required. There's no custom coding required. You just say, I want this dependency, and just do your normal stuff, right? And you provide what you want it to do in the configuration file.
Exactly. And you mentioned it, the configuration file, this access app.json file that we used previously. But so the motivation, so this is the standalone approuter, and it's the standalone approuter. As you said, you could have this index.js file that allows you to extend it, to change something, how it usually happens. But most of our customers were absolutely happy with what the standard package does. They just take it, deploy it, but then they noticed once it's deployed, they have to take care, they have to manage it themselves. So they have to check how much memory is the approuter consuming. And when more people use your web application, it requires more memory. And when you are at the upper threshold of your Cloud Foundry application, you might need to scale it up or scale it out to give more memory to that instance, or add a second instance and distributed traffic. And it felt a little bit strange, I would say, that our customers just take the package as is, don't do any modifications, but then they have some work managing it themselves. So that's why this managed application router is a feature of the Launchpad service. And that allows you basically to let SAP manage the application router for you. So you don't have to care about scaling or how many users you have and when your users are accessing the web application. So you can just say, this is my web application. I store it in the HTML5 application repository. And this configuration that we see here, you just push it to the level of your web application. And this is why we also have a second access app file here. So this is the one we use in production. And this is the one we use for local development.
So yeah, so the local development one is at the top level of your UI directory. And the one that will be in the build tarball to be deployed to the cloud is the one inside the dashboard directory, right?
Exactly. So there are two for two different purposes.
Same content, more or less, isn't it?
Same content, more or less. You're right. And so while you ask a question, you might saw that I triggered the deployment in parallel that should go through really fast. Because the good thing, the second advantage of the managed application router is that if you deploy it, you don't need to deploy a Cloud Foundry application. And that's usually the part that takes the longest during a deployment.
Right.
And now you only have what we can also see in the mta.yaml. There is this, most of what we see here are these resources, the destination service, the HTML5 application repo host, the UAA to make sure only authenticated users can see the data. And the only module is this com SAP application content to create the destination for us.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And for the web application. And this is also, this is just for internal usage to trigger the build of the UI5 module.
So what you're
but
saying
these
here,
are all.
Sorry, Marius. What you're saying here, just so I understand correctly, what you're saying is that we don't need, in this case, an explicit Node.js application runtime context, right? To just to do the app routing.
Exactly. So let's. I think the deployment is almost done. Let's stop the local app router as we don't need it any longer anyway, and run CF apps to see if there are any applications in our Cloud Foundry space.
Drum roll. Nothing.
And you see, no applications found, even though. Yeah, okay, the deployment is still going on. Let's have a look at the services. So you see the services that are created during the deploy, they are all here. So there's this destination service, the host repo, the UAA. But if I run CF apps again, no apps. And that's why it's called, you can also say serverless web application, because there are no server components that you need to manage. You just need to orchestrate the services if you want.
Nice. I like that. Yeah, I like that term. Makes a lot of sense.
So let's go over here to the BTP cockpit and refresh that page because it probably timed out already. And let's see HTML5 applications. Our application dashboard is already here.
That's the thing we just deployed right now.
That's the thing we just deployed, right? So let's click on it. You see I'm authenticated via SSO. That's why I had a redirect here, and the redirect sends me back. And now I basically see our dashboard. So I see the shell bar, I see 3 tiles, but I don't see data. Can you guess why?
It's got to have something to do with authentication, right?
Yes. So I mean, you probably let me. I know the font size is really small here, but let's repeat this one more time because I only want to show you one thing, that it's red here. And I can tell you status code 500. And this is because, let's jump back here to the destinations and filter for wrap, which is the destination that has been created automatically.
So this is the direct result of having that in the destinations.json, right, that we saw before.
Correct. And because we basically we see all values here that we provided in a JSON file, but there was one value that we didn't provide in a JSON file.
Password, did we?
Correct. So let's change that. So because usually if you don't add anything to the default to the destinations JSON file, then you would have to create all these values manually, and it's a lot of clicking and clicking new and save and click additional properties. And now that we defined it in the code, it has been created for us, and the only thing we need to do is to manually insert password, click save.
You just have to have that password in your paste buffer, right? That's perfect. That's good planning, Marius.
Thanks. And now let's repeat it one more time. And this time you see the credits request doesn't turn red. It actually stays white, and that's why we also get it means we got a successful response here, and we see the same data that we previously saw when we ran the dashboard locally with the data from the remote system, and now we see it deployed in the cloud with the data from the remote system.
So let's just stare at this for a second. I'm looking right now at the URL, which of course is different, and that URL sort of suggests to me that this is the Launchpad service or instance of the Launchpad service that you've subscribed to in your trial account. That's why, it's got the word Launchpad in the fully qualified domain name.
Yeah.
And this is, and I can see the index.html there, which I'm hoping we'll be able to dig into how this is built behind the scenes shortly. But that is some static content, some HTML, that's being served from the HTML5 repository service, right, for us.
Yes, exactly. That's what you see here. So in case you wonder, this first part is the subdomain of my sub account. As you correctly recognize, this is the identifier of the Launchpad service. This is the domain of the Cloud Foundry instance in EU10. And here we see the ID, the business service name. And this is the ID of the UI5 application that we see overall here. And this is also the version identifier. So in this index.html, we could also remove it, and then we would be redirected back here.
Is that because of the welcome file, or is that
exactly?
Okay,
that's the welcome file we defined in the Access app up here.
Yep, perfect.
And you can also see, let's go back to the cockpit, to HTML5 applications. Here you see this is the business solution. So this is the name of our business service. It contains a dot here, but in the URL, the dot is exclusively used to separate the business name from the application name. So that's why we see developer keynote as one word dot dashboard dash application version. Okay, yeah, you already mentioned it, the index.html file. So let's have a look at that.
I mean, I love the idea of this because, when you go to a web app or a web page, even, the first thing you probably end up looking at is, the most basic thing, which is, the default HTML content.
Yeah, it's the same. And no matter if it's a regular web page that you develop when you get started with web development, React applications, UI5 applications, Angular applications, all of them have used the concept of index.html. This is really where everything starts in the web.
Yeah.
So let's have a look at that start. It is nothing spectacular here, I would say. It's this regular header or head of the file that defines the title of the page.
But this is what I like, is nothing spectacular. So there's nothing scary or new or frightening. This is, and especially to many of the viewers who are going to be UI5 developers, this is just normal. It's the UI5 bootstrap script.
Exactly. Bootstrapping here. It's using this a little bit more modern bootstrapping that you see when I scroll down here, because you usually say
there's usually a little bit of JavaScript to
you have to
kick something off, right?
Yeah, you have to kick it off, and then you basically inject your start or main component in this body tag with ID. But here we say basically there is a div, and the bootstrapping file will inject our dashboard component in here. So we don't have this place add content that you might know from other UI5 applications.
Exactly.
Or older UI5 applications. Yeah.
So this is a little bit more declarative. In fact, there's no JavaScript in here at all, is there?
No, it's all just, there's only this one script tag. And besides that, no scripting here, nothing else. So let's have a look at this component, this dashboard component.
Yes.
Let's open the component.js. Also here, that's how most main component file look like.
Mm-hmm.
They say the metadata is defined in the manifest.json. So let's jump over there to see how that looks. And this is also pretty standard, I would say. Here we define the name of the business service that we previously saw.
So yeah, this is in fact this first lines 3 through 5. That's something I've not seen that often, right? I mean, SAP.app and SAP.ui, those are fairly common for UI5 applications, but SAP.cloud is something fairly new to me.
Yeah. Yes, that's because you need this property for the managed app router. So if you don't use the managed app router, you don't need it. It's basically just providing this single name here that you then see in the cockpit over here. And then this is the part that you're probably very familiar with, this SAP app that has an ID, the type application, because this overall thing is a UI5 application.
Mm-hmm.
It has a title, a version.
It's even got a data source, a named data source.
Got a named data source that points to a local file called cardsManifest.json. Let's push that back for a minute or two and have a look at that later. And let's continue with the manifest.json. Here, also SAP UI, pretty standard, uses the UI5 technology. It can be rendered on all device types. And SAP UI5 is is coming with a model, the named cards model, that is referring to the data source that we saw previously up here in SAP app. And then there is a root view of the XML type, and that's the end of the file. So let's jump to that root view that we see here. And that is also, again, just a regular UI5 application. There is the shell bar, which is this blue header that we see up here.
And then there is just to be even more trendy than we thought you were, you've got a little bit of CSS in there as well, right?
Yes, so this is just some inline CSS. You could leave that out, but then this margin top wouldn't be here. So this is really just like, because I thought, is it really worth to add a second file for this one CSS rule? I decided no. So that's why I just put it inline in this grid container.
Sounds good to me.
Besides that, the grid container has some settings on the row size and column size and the gap between these grid items.
But and otherwise, this grid container is like a normal grid container that you would use in any UI5 application, right? You've got a few sort of attributes there to say how many in a row and how wide apart they should be and that sort of thing, right? But so that's fairly normal.
Yes, and now we come to the part that is a little bit less normal. It's still not super crazy, but this is where we define the 3 integration cards that you see here. So going back to the web app, 1, 2, 3 items on the grid layout. And here we have the card, just using w:card, linking to a manifest that is whatever this manifest is, we'll see later, but it's a part of this cards data source, cards model behind the stacked column card property or the lines card property or the donut card property.
So I've got loads of questions that are jumping out already. So one of them is, okay, well, we've got this namespace prefix W there, which I don't know what that is. Can we have a look at the top to see what that is?
Sure. You see it in line 4. It's this SAP UI integration widget.
Right. So this basically is the package, the library of the stuff that is represents the widgets, the integration cards that we see, right?
Yes, exactly. And you also see that basically, besides that manifest points to a different property, all integration cards look the same on this in this file here. So you could imagine that the difference between the cards is defined somewhere else.
So actually, that reminds me of the other question I immediately had, which was that the value of that manifest attribute there in each of the 3 cards cases, that looks just like a normal data binding to the cards named model, right? And then you've got separate sections. You've got a stack column card section in that model. You've got a lines card section in that model, and a donut card section in that model. And something tells me that, to me as a a regular UI5 developer, a data binding sort of suggests business data, sales orders and customers and that sort of thing. But this is not quite at that level yet, right?
Yes, absolutely. So it's up to this point, it's business as usual for UI5 developers. There's nothing new that we saw. And there's only one thing that is a little bit new. And as you correctly noticed, it is in this cards model, and it is behind this stacked column card, lines card, and donut card property. So let's go back here. In the manifest file, we saw that this cards model is basically built from the cardsManifest.json file. And when we open that,
yes. And we're also consuming that model. I just noticed in the manifest, we're consuming that cardsManifest.json with a JSON model.
Yes, and we use the JSON model obviously because it is a JSON file with the file ending JSON. Yeah. So and when we look at the file, we see it is this JSON object has 3 properties. No surprise, it's stacked column card, lines card, and donut card. And when we open each of them, so let's have a look at the sections first. We see they have 2 sections. And do these sections?
Whoa, yeah, it's turtles all the way down.
Yeah. So this is basically the same sections that we also kind of have in our manifest.json. So it's just the UI5-like manifest, I would say.
So basically, if you're already familiar with normal UI5 component manifest file structures, this will be nothing new.
Yeah, business as usual, right?
Right.
So there is this SAP app property that defines the ID. So here we just use SAP Developer Keynote as a namespace, and the type here is card, whereas before we used type application in this file here.
Yep.
So, and then because we have a different type, we also use a different property to define what this card is. So we say it is an analytical card. It gets the data from an extension, and this extension has a method getDerivedData.
Ooh, sounds
and
exciting.
down here we basically define or link to this extension that we also see over there. But let's also push that back for a minute, and let's have a look at the rest. So the first card has a header with a title called accumulated credits, and this is
that sounds familiar.
The title that you see up here. And same as here, you see in the header something that says over target, total with showing some numbers. And these are all the strings you find also up in here in the header definition. So there's over target, just total. There's the main indicator with some data binding that we see. So this is basically all declarative here. So we don't have to build the cards and move things around in controls. We just say, this is the card header, please display this data, and that's it.
So again, this is the beauty of being a developer, but not being necessarily a designer. You don't have to worry about the design. You just supply the data and everything slots into place. And I'm guessing also that these specific attributes like main indicator and side indicator are particular to certain card types. So analytical card will have certain properties, and maybe a donut might have slightly different properties.
Yeah, so I think the headers they can also vary, but I think in our examples, they're mostly the same. But besides the header, there is content that defines chart type.
Nice. Okay, that's what I was probably thinking of, yeah.
And that depends, obviously. If you have a stacked column card, you have a plot area with data labels and so on. But let's collapse that here. Let's have a look at the lines chart. Here, very similar SAP app and SAP card property. The card has a header with a main indicator, title, and so on. But the interesting part is in the content, we say the chart type here
now we
is
have a line chart,
yeah. And we say, should the title be visible? What are the labels on the axis?
Mm-hmm.
And in the last one, in the donut card, we obviously have a different plot area and use different dimensions and measures.
Yep.
And so in case you wonder, okay, why is this data defined here in this separate JSON file, and why is it not part of the manifest or not part of the view? And the reason for that is that the UI integration cards, they live in a UI5 application in this scenario here, but they could live in any other application. So let's go here to this overview page.
So what we're looking at here is a special section of the UI5 website that talks specifically about UI integration cards, and I'm noticing that it doesn't say UI5 integration cards or SAP UI integration cards. These are just integration cards, right?
It's just integration cards, and you could basically embed them in any other web application with another framework, or even like in standalone HTML pages that don't use any of the major web development frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
So you can really integrate them wherever you want on the web.
Beautiful.
And this is also why there is this this declaration is not so close to where the UI5 application is declared, because then you can maybe start with a standalone integration card, and at a later point decide to integrate it in the UI5 web application.
I like that separation, and also it keeps the size of each file a little bit more manageable for my small brain. If I'm looking at just one thing at a time.
Yeah, I mean, I feel you absolutely. Same here. So that's one thing we pushed back, this extensions.js file. And here we have this getDerivedData function that returns a promise that basically calls getData, and then it does some data crunching, and it changes the data structure, because you remember we're talking to an OData service, but these integration cards, they want to have a data binding directly to, for example, what the main indicator is. So here I just iterate over the data, or let's say I pull the data with a promise with the fetch API, and then I iterate over the data, create some new properties, calculate some derived properties, and then the data is passed to my integration cards.
So let's just, again, for my benefit, just take a step back. Can we have a look at the JSON definition again to where this getDerivedData, I think it was called a method or a module, wasn't it? A method, yeah, here we go.
Yeah.
So what we're saying here is for this particular card, there's a little helper function or a helper method called getDerivedData. Where is that method? Well, it lives in a file called extension in the same folder, /, and I'm guessing by default as well, it's going to look for a JSON file, a JavaScript file, so extension.js. So that's why we're looking in extension.js in the same directory. And this is, again, just a module definition, sapu.ui.define. I'm seeing there, and it's part of the SAP UI integration library as well. So you just have to extend that. That's what we're doing here, and provide almost like a contract, right? Provide an interface, or provide a method that will be called to go and get the data and marshal it into a structure that is needed to fill in the properties values for the cards. Is that more or less what we're looking at here?
That's exactly spot on.
Because that reminds me a little bit. It's almost like the equivalent, the integration cards equivalent of tiles in a Launchpad. The sort of the analytical tiles and things like that, right? You have a structure that's well defined with property A, B, and C. If you fill those properties with values, the tile will light up.
Exactly. And there's actually one more thing that I would like to show you, because here currently, I mean, you see 3 different chart types that also make different use of the header per card here. But now you might wonder, what types are there? What other cards could I create? And for that, the Card Explorer is the ideal tool. So you see the there's a long URL, but if you just Google for UI integration cards, you end up at this page here. And there you see the Learn and the Explore and the Integrate section. The Integrate section will show you how you can, for example, integrate the cards in a UI5 application or any other web application. But there's also this Explore section that will show you various kinds of cards. So for example, there's a calendar card.
Oh, wow.
There is a timeline card. And these are all cards that are basically predefined. You don't have to design them. You just have to supply the data. And in case you wonder,
all I was going to say was that's the fantastic thing about the UI5 documentation and SDK sites. You know, these explorers. I remember there's an icon explorer and the different component explorers. So it looks like here. Is this sort of you can play around and see what the cards might look like?
Yeah. So let's search for this string here, for example, called upcoming activities. So I see it here.
Yep.
So let's just say live. And while I type, I don't even have to hit run because it's auto run is activated.
Wow. Do that again.
Yeah.
Do something else. Just make sure we that was pretty amazing.
Hello.
Hello. Hi, Mom. That's awesome. Okay. And what you're changing here is the manifest.json, which we've already sort of seen here in your particular app for the integration cards. So this is exactly the same structure that we've been looking at already.
Yeah, in our project, it's called cardsManifest.json, just to avoid confusion with the manifest.json of the UI5 application.
Exactly. And in fact, you know, you can call it whatever you want as long as you have that name in the app's data model source. You know, that's how it's connected together. It's not some sort of naming convention that you need to follow. It's, you know, it's whatever you want.
It's just what we defined here.
Yeah, in the URI.
Exactly.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, that's it. That's actually all I want to show you. And with almost no work and all declarative approaches, we build this beautiful dashboard with 3 integration cards. Yeah.
That is fantastic. So yeah, just to pick up on that, everything was declarative. We had the helper function that took the data from the OData service and marshaled that into the structure we want. But I think that's sort of part and parcel of what the nature of what we're doing here, which is to latch on to a standard format, you know, an entity within an entity set in an OData service, which is fine. We don't want to sort of mess that up, but we want to consume that in a way that makes sense for us. That's why we need to sort of translate it a little bit. But everything else, from the approuter configuration through the MBT build configuration, through the card configuration, through to the actual app configuration itself, everything is solid state.
Yes.
Wow, what a bombshell to finish on. That's fantastic. Marius, thank you so much for joining us on Hands-on SAP Dev. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned so much from you, so thank you for that. And so we'll put the links in the description to all the different things we've seen. And get that repo cloned again and create some integration cards.
Yeah, thanks for having me, DJ. It was a pleasure to be here and show what cool things you can do with like the UI integration cards, the approuter, Business Application Studio, all these great technologies.
Brill. Thanks, Marius. Bye.
Okay. Bye.